The morning sun cast long shadows over the polished floors of Weston Enterprises, a towering corporate office in the heart of the city. Employees rushed in, balancing cups of coffee, checking emails on their phones, and preparing for another busy day. At the far end of the hallway, Walter Grayson, the company's janitor, moved carefully with his mop, making sure the floors were spotless. Walter was in his 60s, with silver hair and tired but kind eyes. He had been working in this building for years, cleaning quietly, never bothering anyone. Most people ignored him. Some greeted him with a polite nod. And then there was Greg Holloway, the regional manager, known for his short temper and sharp tongue. Greg stormed into the building, talking loudly on his phone. He was in a bad mood. The morning traffic had delayed him, and an important meeting was about to start. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the floor as he walked, until suddenly they slipped. Greg lost his balance for a second, but quickly steadied himself. He looked down and saw the wet floor, freshly mopped by Walter. His face turned red with anger. "Are you kidding me?" Greg shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. Employees nearby turned to look. A few assistants stopped typing. Even the receptionist lowered her phone. Walter stepped forward, holding his mop. "I'm sorry, sir. I just finished cleaning. I was about to put the wet floor sign." Greg's eyes burned with rage. "You could have made me fall in front of everyone. Do you even know how important my work is? And here you are, taking your sweet time mopping floors like it's some art project." Walter lowered his head slightly. "I was just doing my job, sir." Greg laughed cruelly. Your job is nothing. Anyone can mop a floor. Maybe that's why you're stuck doing it." The hallway was silent. Employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. Greg wasn't done. He turned to the receptionist. "Do we really need this guy? He's been here forever. And look, he's still just a janitor." Walter remained calm, gripping the handle of his mop. Greg sneered. "You know what? You're fired. Get out. We need someone who knows what they're doing." Gasps filled the hallway. A few employees whispered in shock. Walter blinked slowly but didn't argue. He wiped his hands on his uniform, placed the mop back in the bucket, and gave a slow nod. "All right." That was all he said. No anger, no begging, no defending himself, just one word, and he turned to leave. Greg smirked, feeling powerful. As Walter walked past him, Greg called out one last insult. "Maybe you should find a real job this time." Walter didn't look back. He simply stepped out of the building, leaving behind his years of work and the people who never really saw him. But what no one knew was that Walter Grayson was not just a janitor. The man Gray had just fired owned the entire building. And by morning, everything would change. Walter Grayson walked out of the office building with a calm expression, his old work boots tapping against the sidewalk. The cold morning air brushed against his face, but he didn't seem bothered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. In fact, he almost smiled. As he reached the street corner, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's time," he said simply. On the other side of the line, a deep voice replied, "Understood, Mr. Grayson." Walter hung up and tucked his phone away. He looked back at Weston Enterprises, the company where he had quietly worked as a janitor for years. The tall glass building reflected the city's bright lights, standing proudly in the heart of downtown. And he owned all of it. Few people knew the truth about Walter. Decades ago, he had been a successful businessman, making smart investments in real estate. He had bought this very building before renting it out to various companies. Weston Enterprises had moved in years later, signing a long-term lease. Walter had more money than he could ever spend, but he never cared for a rich man's life. After retiring early, he had felt restless. He wanted something simple, something honest. So he had taken a job as a janitor in his own building. It was a quiet life, and he liked it. Most people ignored him, but that never bothered him. But Greg Holloway had crossed the line. The employees talk. Inside the office, the employees were still in shock. They whispered in hushed voices about what had happened. "Did you see how Greg fired Walter? That was horrible." "Yeah, he didn't deserve that. Walter was always kind to everyone. And Greg acted like he was so much better than him." People felt uneasy. Many of them had never liked Greg. He was arrogant, rude, and treated people badly. But firing Walter in front of everyone, that was too much. Greg feels proud. Meanwhile, Greg sat in his office, feeling proud of himself. He leaned back in his leather chair, smirking. "Finally got rid of that useless old man," he muttered. To him, janitors were nobodies, easily replaceable. He believed that power belonged to people like him. Managers, executives, decision-makers, not to people who cleaned floors. Little did he know, by the next morning, he would be the one standing outside, begging for a job. The next morning, the office was buzzing with excitement and confusion. Something big had happened. Greg Holloway arrived at work, walking into the building with his usual confidence. He was expecting another normal day. Another chance to boss people around, impress the higher-ups, and make himself feel important. But as he reached the reception desk, he noticed something strange. The security guards were staring at him. The receptionist looked nervous. Employees whispered in small groups, stealing glances at him. Greg frowned. "What's going on?" The receptionist swallowed hard before speaking. "Sir, you need to go upstairs." Now, Greg didn't like being ordered around, but something about her voice made him uneasy. He marched toward the elevator, the usual click of his polished shoes echoing through the hallway. A shocking announcement. The moment Greg stepped onto the executive floor, he knew something was wrong. The big conference room was full of people, department heads, senior employees, and even some board members. They were all seated, staring at the large screen at the front of the room. Greg pushed his way inside. "All right, what's the emergency?" The screen flickered, and a new message appeared. "Effective immediately, Weston Enterprises is under new management." Greg blinked. New management. That didn't make sense. A familiar voice spoke up behind him. "Good morning, Greg." Greg spun around, and his jaw dropped. Standing in the doorway, wearing a clean suit instead of his janitor's uniform, was Walter Grayson. For the first time, Greg was speechless. Walter's true identity. Walter stepped forward, his calm eyes sweeping over the room. He wasn't holding a mop this time. He was holding a folder with official documents. "Some of you may not know this," Walter began, "but I am the owner of this building, and as of last night, the new CEO of Weston Enterprises." A wave of shock spread through the room. Employees whispered in disbelief. Greg staggered back like he had been hit. "This is some kind of joke," Greg stammered. "You're a janitor." Walter smiled slightly. "That's what you assumed. But the truth is, I've been watching this company for years. I know every hard-working employee, every honest worker. And I also know who mistreats others." Greg's face turned pale. I didn't know." Walter held up a hand. "You didn't care. Yesterday, you fired me in front of everyone. You humiliated me because you thought I was beneath you." Greg swallowed hard. He could feel every eye in the room on him. The ultimate payback. Walter sighed, closing the folder. "Greg Holloway, effective immediately. You are fired." The room went silent. Greg froze. His mind couldn't process what he had just heard. You can't do this. I've been here for years. You can't just fire me." Walter looked him in the eye. "That's exactly what you said to me yesterday." Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. Walter turned to security. "Please escort Mr. Holloway out." Two guards stepped forward. Greg panicked. "Wait, please. I need this job. I didn't mean it. It was a mistake." But no one stood up for him. No one defended him. The same way he had humiliated Walter the day before, Greg was now being walked out of the building in front of everyone. Only this time, it was permanent. Greg Holloway stumbled as the security guards led him through the hall. His face was red with shock and embarrassment. The same employees he had once ignored or bullied were now watching him, whispering, staring, some even shaking their heads. It was the longest walk of his life. Just yesterday, he had been the powerful manager, barking orders and firing a janitor without a second thought. Now, that same janitor had fired him, right in front of the entire company. His legs felt weak, but the security guards didn't slow down. They walked him straight to the front door, where the receptionist sat. She glanced up at him and sighed. "Good luck, Mr. Holloway." Greg felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to shout at her, but he knew it wouldn't help. The security guards pushed open the glass doors and walked him outside. The cold morning air hit him like a slap. And just like that, he was out. Nowhere to go. Greg stood on the sidewalk, staring at the building. His mind raced. What just happened? What was he supposed to do now? For the first time in years, Greg felt helpless. He had always thought he was untouchable, that his position made him powerful. But now, no job, no respect, no backup plan. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called his boss, Mr. Weston, the original owner of the company. After a few rings, the call connected. "Holloway." Mr. Weston's voice was firm. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding. You need to talk to Walter Grayson. He's ruining everything." Greg's voice was desperate. There was a long silence. Then Mr. Weston sighed. "Walter is my old business partner. He owns this company now. And honestly, Greg, I think he made the right decision." Greg's heart dropped. "Wait, sir, please. I can fix this." But the call ended. Greg stared at his phone, unable to believe what had just happened. No job, no connections, nothing. A humble request. Greg didn't know where to go. He had spent so much time climbing the corporate ladder, stepping on others, making enemies. Now, no one would help him. Then, he saw Walter through the glass window, sitting in the office where Greg used to work. Calm, in control, untouchable. Greg hesitated. Then, with no other choice, he stepped back inside the building. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "I need to see Mr. Grayson," Greg said, his voice quieter than before. She didn't say anything. She just picked up the phone and dialed. After a moment, she nodded. "You can go in." Greg gulped and walked down the hall. Every step felt heavy. He reached Walter's office and stepped inside. Walter sat behind the desk, looking at Greg with the same calm expression. For the first time in his life, Greg Holloway felt small. Greg took a deep breath. Then, in a voice filled with shame, he said the words he never thought he would say. "Please, I need a job." Greg Holloway stood in front of Walter's desk, his hands clenched into fists. He could feel his face burning with shame, but he had no choice. Just yesterday, he had been the one in control, firing employees without a second thought. Now, he was standing in the same spot where Walter had stood when he humiliated him. The silence in the office was heavy. Walter leaned back in his chair, his calm eyes studying Greg. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He just looked disappointed. "You need a job?" Walter asked, his voice steady. Greg swallowed hard. "Yes." Walter sighed and tapped his fingers on the desk. "You had a good job, Greg. A high salary, a respected position. But you threw it away because you thought you were better than others." Greg winced. He knew Walter was right, but admitting it was painful. "I made a mistake," Greg muttered. Walter raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" He leaned forward. "You didn't just make a mistake, Greg. You treated people badly for years. You fired employees for small reasons. You looked down on the janitors, the receptionists, the people who worked hard every day." Greg looked down at his shoes. He had never felt this small before. "I know," he said quietly. "I was wrong." An unexpected offer. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. "All right, Greg. I'll give you a job." Greg's head snapped up. "Really?" Walter nodded. "Yes, but not the job you expect." Greg frowned. "What do you mean?" Walter stood up and walked to the window. Below, Greg could see the janitorial staff working, cleaning the floors, emptying trash bins, doing the job he had once mocked. Walter turned back to Greg. "You're going to work as a janitor." Greg's stomach dropped. "Tell you what?" he stammered. "You heard me," Walter said. "If you really want a job, you'll start at the bottom, just like everyone else." Greg's mouth went dry. He had spent years climbing to the top. Now, Walter wanted him to start over. As a janitor. "You can't be serious," Greg whispered. Walter crossed his arms. "I am. You always thought this job was beneath you. If you want to work here again, prove that you can respect every position in this company." Greg felt sick. His pride was screaming at him to walk away, to leave and find another company where people still respected him. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one respected him anymore. If he left now, he would have nothing. Swallowing his pride, Greg took a shaky breath. "Okay," he finally said. "I'll do it." Walter didn't look surprised. He simply nodded. "Good. You start tomorrow morning." Greg nodded slowly, his face pale. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. As he passed through the hall, employees who once feared him now ignored him. Greg clenched his jaw. He had spent his whole life looking down on others. Now, for the first time, he knew what it felt like to be looked down on. The next morning, Greg Holloway stood in the janitor's room, wearing a gray uniform. His old suit and tie were gone. Instead of a polished desk, he held a mop and a bucket. His hands trembled as he gripped the handle. This wasn't a temporary punishment. This was his new job. Walter's words echoed in his mind. "If you want to work here again, prove that you can respect every position in this company." Greg took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The other side. As he walked through the office, employees whispered. Some glanced at him with pity, while others barely noticed him at all. This was the same hallway where he had once walked with confidence, issuing orders and demanding respect. Now he was just another worker. Just a janitor. Greg forced himself forward, stopping near the break room. His first task was simple: mop the floors. He dipped the mop into the bucket and began cleaning. At first, it seemed easy, but within minutes his back started to ache. The mop was heavy, the water smelled of chemicals, and the movements were tiring. By the time he finished the hallway, sweat dripped down his forehead. He glanced at the clock. Only 30 minutes had passed. How do janitors do this every day? He wondered, rubbing his sore arms. A familiar face. As Greg leaned against the wall, exhausted, a familiar voice spoke. "Need some help?" Greg looked up and saw James, the janitor he had fired just days ago. James held another mop, his expression calm. He wasn't smiling, but he also wasn't mocking Greg. Greg felt his stomach twist. If their roles had been reversed, he might have laughed. He might have made a rude comment. But James, he was simply offering help. Greg hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess I do." James nodded back and started mopping beside him. They worked in silence. For the first time, Greg saw the job from James's perspective. The tired muscles, the aching back, the endless tasks. It wasn't easy. And yet James did it without complaint. A moment of reflection. After an hour, Greg stopped and wiped his forehead. "How did you do this for so many years?" he asked, still breathing heavily. James shrugged. "It's a job, just like any other. Pays the bills." Greg nodded slowly. He had never thought about it that way. To him, janitors had always been invisible, just workers in the background. Now he realized how wrong he had been. They were just as important as anyone else. For the first time in his life, Greg felt respect for a job he had once looked down on. As they continued working, something changed in him. He wasn't just mopping the floors anymore. He was learning a lesson. Greg Holloway had never felt this tired in his life. His arms were sore, his back ached, and the mop felt heavier every time he lifted it. For years, he had thought janitorial work was easy, just pushing a mop and wiping surfaces. But after only one day, he understood how wrong he had been. James, the janitor he had fired, worked beside him, moving quickly and efficiently. Greg struggled to keep up. As they cleaned another hallway, James glanced at him. "You're getting better," he said. Greg let out a weak chuckle. "I feel like I ran a marathon." James smirked. "You'll get used to it." A different perspective. Later that day, Greg found himself emptying trash bins in the office he once ruled. He walked past employees he used to command. Some gave him curious looks. Others ignored him completely. No one rushed to greet him. No one lowered their voice in respect. For the first time, Greg felt invisible. He paused near the break room, where two employees whispered, "Can you believe it? Greg Holloway, the big boss, is a janitor now. Serves him right. He treated people terribly." Greg clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. They were right. He had been a terrible boss, cold, arrogant, and dismissive of anyone he thought was beneath him. Now he was the one at the bottom. An unexpected conversation. As Greg dumped the trash into the bin outside, a voice called out, "Mr. Holloway." He turned to see Linda, the receptionist, watching him with a hesitant expression. Greg forced a small smile. "It's just Greg now." Linda nodded. I wanted to say, I hope you're doing okay." Greg blinked. "You do." Linda shrugged. "You weren't always the nicest boss, but everyone deserves a second chance." Greg felt a lump in his throat. He had expected mockery, maybe pity, but not kindness. He nodded slowly. "Thanks, Linda." She smiled before heading back inside. For the first time since he started this job, Greg felt something different. Hope. A lesson learned. That night, Greg sat in the janitor's closet, staring at his hands. They were rough, sore, and covered in cleaning solution. Just a few days ago, they had only ever held a pen or a coffee cup. Now they had scrubbed floors, taken out trash, and wiped down desks. And somehow he felt more accomplished than he had in years. He was finally earning his place, not demanding it. And for the first time, he was proud of it. Greg Holloway walked into the office building. But this time, something felt different. For years, he had entered this place with his head held high, expecting people to move out of his way. He had been the boss, the man who gave orders and made decisions. Now he was just Greg, the janitor. But somehow, that no longer bothered him. Respect earned, not given. As he moved through the hallways with his mop and bucket, employees greeted him. "Morning, Greg. How's it going?" It was a small change, but he noticed it. Before, people had spoken to him only out of fear or obligation. Now, they spoke because they wanted to. Greg wasn't sure if it was pity or kindness, but either way, it felt better than fear. A surprising offer. At lunchtime, Walter, the man who had taken over his position, walked up to him. "Greg, do you have a minute?" Greg wiped his hands on his uniform. "Of course." Walter led him to an empty conference room and gestured for him to sit. "You've been working hard," Walter said. "I've been watching." Greg felt a twinge of nervousness. Walter sighed. "I know it wasn't easy. You could have quit, but you didn't. That means something." Greg swallowed. "I needed to learn." Walter nodded. "And you did." Then he slid a paper across the table. Greg's eyes widened. It was a job offer. Operations supervisor, a position below his old one, but far above janitor. "You want me back?" Greg asked, stunned. Walter smiled. "We want the new Greg, the one who understands what real work looks like." A choice to make. Greg stared at the paper. A few weeks ago, he would have signed it immediately. But now he hesitated. Something had changed in him. He didn't just want a title anymore. He wanted to be a better leader, someone who earned respect, not demanded it. Greg looked up. "I'll take the job." Walter nodded. "Good choice." One last task. Before Greg left his janitor's uniform behind, he went to find James. The older janitor was restocking supplies, just as he had done for years. Greg approached him. "James, I wanted to say thank you." James looked up, surprised. "For what?" Greg took a deep breath. "For teaching me. For not rubbing it in my face. For showing me how hard you work." James smirked. "Figured you'd see it eventually." Greg reached into his pocket and pulled out his first paycheck as a janitor. He pressed it into James's hand. "This is yours." James frowned. "Greg, I can't." "You can. You trained me. Consider it a bonus." James hesitated, then finally smiled. "You're all right, Holloway." Greg grinned. "Call me Greg." A new journey. As Greg walked out of the janitor's closet for the last time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not because of his job title, not because of his power, but because he had finally learned what it meant to lead. And this time, he would do it right.